From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already subscribing to Free Expression, please do sign up wherever you do your podcast listening. This week, the final push. We're less than 2 weeks now from the close of polls in the 2024 election. And if there's a single voter left in the country who hasn't made up his mind yet, well, at this stage, he or she is probably never going to. After a long election campaign that's been marked by a series of literally unprecedented events, the criminal conviction of one of the candidates, the late withdrawal from the race by the incumbent president, his replacement by a candidate who's never won a single primary vote, the race still seems to be almost exactly where it was a year ago, tied. And yet, while the polling suggests the outcome is a toss-up, there does seem to be a growing sense that Donald Trump has the edge over Kamala Harris. From both sides are coming hints and rumors that the evidence they're seeing from key battleground states is that the Republican former president has the advantage. Early voting patterns, internal polling, most of all perhaps a nagging sense that as they've done in the last two presidential contests, the public pollsters may be underestimating Trump's support. All these have led to a growing number of commentators, and by no means all Republican-friendly, to conclude that the race is the GOP candidates to lose. So what's the reality, or at least what's the view from the Republican camp? This week I'm pleased to be joined by Doug Burgum, governor of North Dakota and a key ally of the former president. Burgum ran for the Republican nomination himself, of course, before backing out and endorsing Trump. And he was on the Republican nominees' final shortlist of potential vice presidential candidates before Trump picked J.D. Vance. And I'm pleased to say that Doug Burgum joins me now. Governor, thanks for joining Free Expression.
Fabulous to be with you, Gerry. Thanks for having me on.
So, Governor, as I said in my introduction, the polling in this campaign, as it has done pretty well throughout, still seems to suggest the race is too close to call. But the kind of the mood music that we're hearing from both campaigns, I think it's fair to say, and from some of the kind of unofficial polling and some of the commentators who are close to the campaigns, do seem to suggest that President Trump has maybe the slight edge. Do you agree with that? And if so, why do you think that is?
Well, I do agree with that. And having been on the ground in a number of these swing states, I feel that the voter intensity, the energy across a whole new set of Trump supporters, whether it's 400 college kids at a Michigan State fraternity sorority party that were all, screaming Trump's name, and Trump wasn't even there. I mean, I was there and saw it firsthand. There's some different pockets of voters that weren't with him in 16 or 20 that are there now. But to bring this back to economics, I mean, I feel like his edge is the Harris EV mandates. In Pennsylvania, his edge is, the Harris extreme green energy policy. In Arizona, his edge is the border policy. Possibly in Nevada, Democrats have got a great machine for getting out the votes there. But I think both candidates promising no tax on tips. Trump said it first. I think he may be more attached to that claim. That could be an edge for service workers in Nevada. So as I look around some of these swing states, it just feels like close race, but momentum goes to Trump. And the core decision-making often, as you know, in these elections at the very end, is people vote their pocketbooks. And when everybody across all identity groups are getting crushed still by inflation, advantage goes to Trump.
We have a lot of early voting these days. Significant numbers of people have voted already. We've got another almost 2 weeks of it. Getting some early returns in. It's very hard, I know, always to interpret. Some states don't even tell us the party identification. Some states do, but we can't be certain what it represents. But are you seeing anything from what you've seen in the early voting so far that gives you any indication of which way the race is heading in these key states?
Well, I think the early voting is making the Democrats very nervous. Because they had this was a playing field all to themselves. And if you think of American football, 4-quarter game, Democrats would be on the field for 3 quarters and the Republicans were in the locker room. They built up a huge lead. If Republicans won a race, it's because everybody showed up on election day and they came from behind to win. They're looking at some of the early reporting in these states, and the Republicans are, equivalent number of Republicans voting as Democrats. Republican numbers way up in early voting, Democrats way down. I'm sure that's got them terrified, because if you had the same outcome on election day, then this could be a blowout for Republicans and not vice versa. But we don't know. Since we're in new territory, we don't know. All we're doing is pulling Republican votes ahead to early voting, and then Republican voting on election day is going to be down. Hard to tell, because this is new territory for the Republican Party.
One thing we do seem to have pretty clear evidence of, I'm citing various surveys that have been done of polling, at least nationwide, is typically, in elections now for decades, Democrats have have had a registration advantage. That registration advantage, again, particularly in these key states, does seem perhaps to have been reduced or even wiped out. Again, is that another positive sign that you look at for the Republican Party?
Yeah, absolutely, because registration, of course, leads voting. I mean, registering doesn't mean you're going to vote, but it certainly increases the universe, and once registered, easier for the get out the vote, chase the vote type ground activity to happen more effectively door to door. And I think the Republicans have closed the gap on some of this get out the vote during the early voting. And I think, again, that has to be making the Democrats nervous, because Republicans are executing better during this, run up to Election Day than they have in the past.
Again, Democrats have traditionally had a bit of an advantage when it comes to getting out the vote, the so-called ground game. They have tremendous organization, again, particularly in these key states, helps a lot sometimes, by union organization, but just the fact that they also control many of the sort of political organizations in these states, particularly many of the state organizations and the city organizations. And the Trump campaign has kind of seems to have largely outsourced get out the vote operation to outside groups. Is that a concern for you at all?
It's not a concern, but Republicans are catching up. But we have to look at the geography here. I mean, if this was who's going to win in rural areas, we always see, the map after the case where, Trump wins virtually every rural county in America. The Democrats have to concentrate on such a small piece of geography in America on these get out the votes. I mean, if you're talking about, 19 counties that you have to get the vote out in, and you've got union operations, people that get a day or two off from work, outdoor knocking, driving people to the polls, they've got a geographic logistics advantage. I mean, if you're UPS, would you rather be delivering 50 packages on the same block or, one package every 50 miles? And so there's a little bit of the density that just naturally favors the Democrats. So I think the outsourcing made a lot of sense to, reach some of these places where maybe we didn't have the infrastructure built within the Republican Party. But I'd say, net, the Republicans are doing the best they ever have, and Democrats are down. So Republicans are optimistic at this point.
Again, what's probably going to be we don't know if it's going to be a close race, but what certainly the polling suggests looks like it's a close race, even if, for the reasons we've discussed, Donald Trump maybe slightly in better shape than the poll suggests. But the question of the integrity of the ballot is going to be incredibly important again. I know there's been a lot of preparation on this. I know the RNC has worked heavily on this, and I know on the Democratic side they're doing the same thing too. Do you have any concerns here about, either particular states or about the broader picture of, there's been suggestions that maybe non-citizens are voting. There are question marks again about things like ballot harvesting and stuff like that. Can Americans really trust the ballot process, do you think?
Well, as a governor in our state, it's the Secretary of State that has the primary responsibility for election integrity. But understanding what our rules are versus other states, and understanding how some states even vary by county. I mean, this isn't a national election. It's 50 states, but there's 3,000 plus counties in America. And we know that when we've had, challenges, 1960, that was in Cook County, one county, the presidential election came down between Nixon and Kennedy. In 2000, it was Broward County in Florida. It was one. We know that in 2016, when Trump won, Democrats were screaming that he was an illegitimate candidate, hadn't won, Russian interference. In 2020, that's all been, very much litigated. But in 2020, I was a sitting governor in 2020, and I know that with the fall of 2020, pre-vaccine, but COVID, some of the executive orders that went out that gave counties the ability to do that, we had more change and more openness and less control in the 2020 election than we've ever had before. And no one talks about that anomaly. But when you had states that had never before doing massive mail-out ballots, unrequested. Now, I'm not talking about absentee or mail-in, but mailing them out to everybody on the voter rolls when they hadn't cleaned up the voter rolls for decades. And as someone who, spent my career in business and spent it in tech, I think anybody knows how important your customer list is. And if your customer list isn't up to date and curated, and companies spend all kinds of money maintaining clean customer lists, but states, in many cases, with these voter rolls didn't. So you had way more ballots being mailed out than there was even citizens in a state or voters in a state, and then unmonitored drop boxes, which was a totally new thing in 2020. So it got done and everybody said, oh, there's no proof. Well, I spent my career in tech, and a lot of that career was in selling business process software. I mean, there isn't any public company in America that would show up and say, well, here's my quarterly earnings, but you have to trust me because I've got an invoice that shows the earnings, but they can't show you a purchase order. They can't show you a check. They can't show you the cash, all the things that would have happened preceding that transaction. action. So the fact that we had, ballots in unmonitored drop boxes, I don't think gives me comfort that we had, the chain of control of those documents through an election process like we did when we had in-person voting. Or in North Dakota, you actually have to have a voter ID. When we have an entire party that protests voter ID, that seems absurd. In North Dakota, your voter ID has to also indicate that you're a U.S. citizen. I mean, you can get a driver's license in North Dakota, but it says right on there that you're not a U.S. citizen, so it's not valid for voting. So some states like North Dakota, I'm very confident. Other places, I think, give me pause, and hopefully that we're going to have a large enough victory here, obviously cheering for President Trump, but large enough that we don't have to have a debate about who won. But if we do, it's important for both sides, Republicans, Independents, Democrats. We have to have election security in a democracy, or democracy doesn't work.
Voting will be closing throughout the evening on November 5th. How long do you think it's going to be after the polls close before we have clear result? Again, it's one of those things that raises so many doubts in people's minds about the integrity of the election. It's interesting, you used the football analogy earlier where you said, the Democrats are on the field for the first three quarters and then the Republicans come on for the fourth quarter. That very phenomenon of the fact that on the day votes are counted quickly, and we often have to wait days to get the mail-in ballots in particular, produces the opposite effect, which is that Republicans race out to an early lead in the first three quarters, as it were, and then the Democratic votes come piling in later. And we've heard some states saying it could take 4 or 5 days for them to know the results. What are you hearing?
Well, I think, again, this is where there's going to be more attention on this election in terms of the securing the vote, and post November 5th and beyond is going to have more scrutiny than ever before. I mean, more poll watchers, more election officials, being observed. And so there's just going to be a lot of attention to this. And I think, again, in a good scenario, we've got a clean answer. And if one state doesn't have results for 3 or 4 days, but one of the candidates, hopefully President Trump, under multiple scenarios, he could have enough electoral votes that night. We know who the winner is. And if it takes another state 3 or 4 days to figure it out, that won't be the deciding electoral count. But I'm hoping that we'll have a clean, quick answer, because that helps build everybody's confidence in the system.
President Trump has said again that he'll accept the result if he thinks it's fair. Can you see any circumstances in which, if the final results suggest that Donald Trump has lost, can you see any circumstances in which he accepts that result?
Well, I think it depends on, which county and which result. And as you say, I mean, if it, gets overturned 5 days after the election because somebody discovered a bunch of boxes that they didn't know was there, well, that makes everybody nervous. If you have that kind of fact pattern versus a election that gets determined by a win that night. So we've had leading Democrats in Congress came out 2 weeks ago and said they wouldn't commit to accepting the results until they actually saw what happens. And I think, again, it's tough to answer these hypotheticals because we don't know what kind of issues you might run into. And again, it won't be a national problem. It'll be down to 1 or 2 counties, which has been our history in America in past elections.
What are the chances, basically, that one side or the other just doesn't accept the results of the election and that we have a standoff, either of the sort we had in 2000, which, was litigated, Bush v. Gore, finally ending in the Supreme Court 5 weeks later, or 2020, which went right through to January the 6th and all the unrest that we saw on that day? Are you concerned that we're headed for a really tense period of post-election uncertainty?
Well, I hope not. And if people want to see what that feels like, you can watch the movie Recount, which it came out in 2008. And interestingly enough, I mean, the brand of the party that's concerned about election results being stuck on Republicans the last 4 years. I mean, if people want to watch that movie with Kevin Spacey playing Ron Klain, who you would know was Joe Biden's chief of staff as president.
Well, I saw Ron Klain back there in Florida in Tallahassee in 2000. So yeah,
yes,
I well remember that.
Yeah. So we had the person that was, fundamentally almost running the country under Joe Biden. De facto was the guy leading the charge for the Democrats protesting the election in 2000. So both parties, when they lose, are willing to push on this for months forward. And I guess we hope for America, given what we've got with our economy, with the wars abroad, with the open border, given for America, I hope that we have a clean answer quickly that allows us to move forward.
We're going to take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more with Doug Burgum, Governor of North Dakota, talking about the remaining days in the presidential election, and particularly if there's anything at all he thinks that might change the trajectory of the race in this final period. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
I'm back with Doug Burgum, Governor of North Dakota, one-time candidate for president himself, and we're talking about the final stages of the 2024 presidential election. I want to move on to the sort of final 10 days or so of the campaign that we're heading into. But just quickly, I want to ask you about Congress too. How do you see first of all, the Senate races? I mean, there are these critical races that it looks like, everybody I think thinks that the Republicans are going to win, obviously, governor in West Virginia. It does look like Tim Sheehy in Montana looks in pretty good shape to beat incumbent John Tester. But all the others, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, maybe even, Ted Cruz in Texas in a little bit of trouble. How do you see the Senate races right now?
I'm drawing the same conclusion as you. The Republicans are going to have control of the Senate, at least by one vote. Jim Justice, of course, I've served as a fellow Republican governor. He's going to comfortably win in West Virginia. Tim Sheehy, my neighbor to the west in Montana, running a fantastic race, a terrific candidate, outstanding. Not only his military service, but the excellent business person that he is and the business that he's built, really impressive. Those two, I think, are going to give the Republicans the edge. But in some of these swing states, Pennsylvania, when you start seeing a Democrat candidate running an ad showing that they agree with President Trump, that tells me that we've got a good shot in Pennsylvania with McCormick there. And I've campaigned with Rogers in Michigan. I think there's a shot there too as well. We've got some very good Republican candidates, and depending on how the top of the ticket is going, maybe we can pull a couple more and have a little bit of a bigger margin in the Senate, which of course is critical when it comes to Senate confirmation and moving the Trump agenda forward.
And the House, sort of general expectation seems to be that the House is probably going to go whichever way the presidency goes. Is that your view too?
Yes, I think so. And there's certainly nobody predicting a landslide movement there, but obviously fingers crossed that the Republicans are going to be able to hold on to a slight majority there.
Let's talk again about these final 10 days and some of the issues. Let me just quickly ask you about something. We're recording this on Wednesday afternoon, and something I want to ask you, which has been in the headlines in the last 24 hours or so. These allegations about Donald Trump, particularly from his former chief of staff, General John Kelly, allegations that Trump said very admiring things about Adolf Hitler. I wondered why he couldn't have generals like Adolf Hitler. This kind of fits in as well with the story that supposedly former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, has said that Trump is a fascist and wants to kind of run the country like a sort of a fascist dictator. What do you make of these? I
discount all of these when you've got former team members that wait for 4 years till 2 weeks before election to release shocking, I overheard this, overheard that. There has been for 8 or 9 years, there's so much of, this is what President Trump has said, this is what he supposedly said, this is what I overheard him said. And you got to know President Trump better this year than the time when the 4 years when I was serving underneath him as a governor. We had a professional relationship, but getting to know him on a more personal level, if you spend time with him, you don't see any of this kind of behavior that people are describing. And, my time with him when we were with, roundtables and when he was out traveling in the States early on, even before he'd secured the nomination, the guy is very curious. He's a great listener. Frontline people, whether they're people that are working at a construction site or whether it's somebody who's worked for 15 years at Mar-a-Lago on the staff, they love working for him. They respect him. He listens. He asks great questions. And I think, again, it's just like I kind of wish everybody would have a chance to actually see the person. It's a little bit like in Hollywood, you see a star, you like him on the screen, and then you hear about all this other stuff, and you don't know whether it's the, sort of the Hollywood reporter, what's the gossip line on it or not, but you never really get to know the person. I got a chance to get to know President Trump, so I take all of this stuff as the final 2-week political rhetoric, and I think it's all built into a campaign theme. And I think what's, was delightful was a poll that came out this week that people trust President Trump more to protect democracy than they do Kamala Harris. And I think that's the bottom line that says all of these attacks are not working.
Why would someone like John Kelly, a man who served his country with great distinction as a soldier, why would he say something like that?
I asked that question of someone this morning myself, and I don't have an answer for that. I can't speculate on a person's, personal motivations on why that would be. But people are lining up on their teams and making their statements for their teams. This is in the final couple weeks of the election, and people are coming out to say what they're going to say. But I think the fact that we've had President Trump serve as president for 4 years, we saw what he delivered on the economy. We saw what he delivered in terms of prosperity at home and peace abroad. I'm looking at the actual results. I'm a data-driven business guy. I look at the results versus look at the hearsay, the he said, she said stuff. It surrounded him for 30 years, the he said, she said stuff. And I think it, has to be extremely discounted. And let's look at what he got done when he was president. And America was better off and our allies were better off.
So let's look at these final 10, 12 closing days. What's President Trump's closing argument going to be?
Well, I think the election in the end is going to be determined on the things that matter most to the voters. I mean, there's very few swing voters left that haven't made up their mind, but I think as it's been in all elections, they're going to vote in their own personal self-interest. And for a lot of them, that's going to be the economy. When you take a look at the prices, you're familiar with this. The Journal writes about it all the time. But when you got electricity up 30+%, you've got the price of food, the price of gas, the price of rent, the cost of interest, affordability of housing. I mean, all of these things are just hitting people so hard. Their real income is down under Harris. It was up under Trump. So if they're voting how they feel about the economy, then they're going to vote for President Trump if they're undecided. And if they're someone who's living in one of our major cities and they've seen crime go through the roof, they've seen their inner city collapse post-COVID, whether it's homelessness or it's the high cost of illegal immigration that might be hitting their city or their state, then the border, every major city is in every state's become a border state. And I think for some people, the border is going to be the issue. And if those show up on all the polls as number one and number two, who do you trust in the economy? Who do you trust on securing the border? President Trump wins. And so I think his closing argument is going to be those two things. And then obviously we got the world in chaos. I believe we are closer to World War III. The last month I've been in Israel, met with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I just got back from Korea last week, South Korea, Republic of Korea, our great ally there, met with President Yoon there. I mean, our allies, they need to have a strong American economy and they need to have a strong American president that's going to stand by them. And I think that our allies are cheering for President Trump. They don't get to vote, but it's pretty clear that Iran, who I think is the real existential threat to the world right now, them getting a nuclear weapon is the real threat that we have to pay attention to. They're closer than they ever have been, and they're cheering for Harris. I mean, they're trying to assassinate Trump. They're trying to hack his account, and they're doing everything they can to help Harris get elected. That ought to tell something, but I don't think voters are as focused on that. I think voters at home, the swing voters, are going to be focusing on the economy and the border, and when it comes down to that, those undecideds are going to fall Trump's direction.
Is there anything, again, that worries you now in the fight? Again, it's a close race. Again, we all everybody does seem to perhaps think that Trump maybe has the slight advantage, but it is close. It could go either way. If you wake up on November 6th or November 7th, November 8th, or whatever it is in the middle of the day as it was last time, and it's declared for Harris, what will have gone wrong in your view? What could go wrong for Trump that could still deny him this? What concerns you?
Well, I think that, again, it's the execution. Trump has run a great race. I mean, people said he would, never ever be in this position. People couldn't imagine it. I think it shows what a fighter is. It shows how resilient it is. It shows how perseverant it is. It shows that he's put together a strong team. In the end of the day, it's not the personality of President Trump versus the personality of Vice President Harris. I mean, you're voting for a team and there's, 4,000 appointees. And as a business person and as a governor and the governor of a natural resources state, it just so hands down that our country is going to be better off with the team that Trump is going to bring in. And when you got a pro-growth, pro-business, deregulation, pro-U.S. energy, all of those things, those are things that are actually going to help raise America up. And of course, as you know, Jerry, I mean, I've been very vocal that the Harris-Biden energy policies they're not only hurting America and hurting American workers and American families at home, but that's what's empowering our adversaries, Russia, Iran. We're in two major proxy wars, and our opponents are funding their side with the failed energy policies of the Harris-Biden administration. So I think this is a very consequential election. And if we don't get the message across to Americans about how important that's going to be, I think there could be a lot of voter regret down the road, because with the higher taxes of Harris, taxes on unrealized capital gains, all the promises of spending that she's made, it's going to take us down a path that we don't want to go. And President Trump, yes, we've got a large national debt, but he also understands that we have a balance sheet. And on that balance sheet, Americans' asset includes the 240 million acres on our balance sheet on the asset side that Theodore Roosevelt put away for the benefit and the use of the American people. And if we can, sustainably develop those resources, we've got an opportunity to not only have lower inflation, but high growth. And again, sell energy to our friends and allies versus them buying it from our adversaries. All of that is game changing for the United States and for the world.
You mentioned the team that Donald Trump will bring with him to Washington if he gets elected. Do you want to be part of that team?
My focus right now is helping President Trump get elected elected. If he's elected, there are so many qualified and wonderful and talented people, both that have served with them before, that haven't served with them before, from the private sector that want to be part of that administration. But I'm, spending zero time on transition, and whatever time I have away from my fantastic job of being governor of North Dakota is making sure that we have a chance to talk about how to staff a Trump administration. That takes winning first, which we talked about in the first part of this.
Yeah, term comes to an end in the next month or two. You've got a tremendous business background and, of course, great experience in the energy sector in particular, and all kinds of jobs that I'm sure Donald Trump would love to have you do, aren't there?
Well, he's been generous and kind with his comments, but I know that he's very focused on winning this election, and I know he appreciates the people that are also focused on winning the election versus focusing on what chair they're going to sit in, because there'll be plenty of opportunity to serve going forward, whether it's in the public sector, the private sector. If we have a Trump leadership, Trump economy, Trump team moving America forward, there'll be all kinds of opportunities for every American.
Doug Burgum, Governor of North Dakota, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Free Expression.
Thank you, Jerry.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Free Expression. Thank you again for joining us. I'll be back next week for one last look at the election in the final days as we enter the last week. In the meantime, enjoy your week and look forward to speaking to you next week.